I never left my desk. I never raised my voice. But I made their trains late, just enough to matter. Each stamp, each digit, each missing slip, it all passed beneath their gaze. They took the ledger. They never knew my name. By late summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht had entrenched itself firmly across occupied Western Europe. With France subdued, Belgium under military administration, and vital industrial infrastructure feeding the Nazi war machine, logistical efficiency had become paramount to sustaining operations on the Eastern Front. Supply lines stretched from Germany's Ruhr heartland to rail depots in Warsaw and Smolensk, requiring precision, timeliness, and reliability. Every trainload of coal, ammunition, spare parts, or medical equipment contributed directly to the Reich's eastern ambitions. In Belgium, the railway system was a crucial node in this vast apparatus. The city of Liège, long known for its ironworks and transport infrastructure, sat astride multiple strategic rail corridors. Trains moved eastward from Liège toward Aachen, Cologne, and further into the occupied zones of the Soviet Union. The Germans had commandeered the Belgian National Railway Company, SNCB-NMBS, placing loyalist administrators and German overseers in charge of critical stations while retaining local staff for continuity and technical expertise. Among these employees was a man named Albert De Wilde, a clerk assigned to Liège-Guillemins station. At 52 years old, De Wilde was unremarkable in appearance and routine. He wore the standard-issue railway jacket with a dark wool cap, and his desk was positioned near the scheduling kiosk where timetables were printed, updated and circulated daily. He had worked for the railway since the mid-1920s and was regarded by colleagues as quiet, punctual and meticulous. De Wilde's responsibilities included logging train arrivals and departures, filing transportation manifests, and transmitting dispatches between stations. Though his duties seemed clerical in nature, they placed him at the heart of the region's logistical nervous system. His station processed hundreds of military trains monthly, laden with fuel drums, artillery pieces, or crates marked Verpflegung, provisions. Every item was tracked in triplicate, with copies sent to administrative hubs in Brussels, Cologne, and Berlin. As the German war economy intensified, minor inconsistencies in train schedules began to attract scrutiny. A delayed shipment of ammunition to the Siegfried Line, or a misrouted locomotive could result in reprimands or worse. The Germans introduced strict accountability protocols. Station chiefs faced demotion or imprisonment for repeated logistical failures. Belgian personnel, while retained for operational knowledge, were monitored closely by Gestapo observers and informants planted within the workforce. It was under these circumstances that De Wilde continued his work, rarely drawing attention. He rarely spoke during inspections and did not associate with known resistors. Yet behind this exterior, he had begun to observe anomalies, minor irregularities in locomotive assignments, discrepancies between manifest contents and wagon markings, and the quiet reshuffling of a rolling stock onto alternate tracks. These occurrences often went unnoticed by German officers who lacked deep familiarity with the local rail system. Throughout the winter of 1941-42, an increasing number of trains failed to arrive at their destinations on time. Some disappeared altogether for days before reappearing at sidings kilometres away from their intended path. In isolated incidents, cargoes were found missing, or carriages arrived loaded with entirely unintended freight. Food intended for troops replaced with machine parts or construction timber. To many within the German Transport Command, these appeared to be the inevitable growing pains of a sprawling supply chain strained by war. Investigations were launched, but none produced definitive proof of sabotage. The Belgian clerical staff, including De Wilde, continued to submit routine reports, each one stamped, filed, and cross-checked. Yet within the files De Wilde handled, subtle patterns emerged. Routing slips, which dictated the exact path a train would take from origin to destination, were stored in an aging cabinet near his desk. In theory, only senior dispatchers could alter these slips, but in practice, any clerk with access and sufficient knowledge of German notation could make small changes, particularly during late shifts when German oversight was minimal. Albert De Wilde, with his long memory and quiet authority over the paperwork, began experimenting. At first, the changes were minute, altering a single digit in a train number, or adjusting a departure time by 30 minutes. Later, he grew bolder. In one instance, He reassigned a coal train destined for Rostock to a secondary line that would leave it idling for hours at a disused freight yard. The Germans chalked it up to clerical error. De Wilde said nothing. The more he learned, the more De Wilde came to understand the vulnerability of the system. German control was deep but brittle. Their dependency on local knowledge, coupled with the language barrier and sheer volume of data, created cracks that a single clerk could quietly exploit. He began noting which types of trains generated the most urgency among German officers, those bearing medical supplies, for instance, or transports bound for forward repair depots in the Reichskommissariat Ostland. By the spring of 1942, German officers at Liège-Guillemins noticed that delays and reroutes clustered around a particular corridor connecting Liège to the Aachen rail yard. At first, they suspected faulty telegraph protocols. Later, they investigated sabotage by railway workers. But despite multiple reviews, they failed to detect the precise origin of the disruption. For De Wilde, this period was critical. He was aware that suspicion was mounting and that security protocols were being reinforced. German personnel began rotating through the station more frequently, and a new regulation required that 2 clerks verify each routing change. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and many senior German officers still preferred to delegate paperwork to Belgian staff. De Wilde retained access to the routing files. Despite the added scrutiny, his actions grew more methodical. He timed his alterations with shifts when senior staff were absent, and began coordinating quiet delays by mislabeling priority shipments as routine freight. On at least 2 occasions, he managed to insert duplicate routing orders, sending the same convoy to 2 different sidings, creating confusion and stalling dispatches for hours. Still, not every attempt succeeded. In some cases, the Germans caught the error and corrected it before the train departed. In others, a cautious dispatcher overruled the paperwork and telephoned the next station for confirmation. De Wilde made note of these failures and adjusted his methods accordingly. His role remained undetected, but he understood that every new delay increased the risk of discovery. At the same time, he remained just a clerk, unarmed, unconnected to resistance networks, and without the means to flee if arrested. His disruptions, while quiet, were dangerous, yet they were also invisible, buried in the paper flow of a war run by schedules and freight codes. By early summer 1942, the German Transport Inspectorate was preparing a formal review of the Liège corridor. A new officer from the Reichsbahn headquarters in Berlin had been dispatched to examine the persistent inefficiencies. Additional record checks were ordered, and files from regional offices were to be compared for consistency. Albert De Wilde continued to report for work each day, arriving precisely at 6:30, logging departures with his usual ink-stained ledger, and retrieving routing slips from their familiar drawer. He was just one among dozens of civil servants maintaining the machinery of occupation. And yet the machinery was beginning to stutter. By mid-July 1942, the situation along the Liège-Aachen rail corridor had become a matter of growing concern within the German Military Logistics Command. Reports from the Eastern Front indicated irregularities in resupply efforts originating from Western Europe. Although these delays were rarely catastrophic on their own, the cumulative effect was beginning to show. Workshops waited longer for spare parts. Field hospitals reported shortages of basic supplies, and a growing number of trains failed to meet their scheduled rendezvous points for transshipment. For German officers overseeing the Reich's transport network, these problems could not be easily attributed to a single cause. Wartime wear on infrastructure, overextended personnel, and increased Allied bombing raids on marshalling yards in France all contributed to the system's growing fragility. Still, the Liège region stood out. Despite its strategic importance and relatively undamaged facilities, the corridor experienced a higher-than-average rate of errors, misroutings, and unexplained delays. Albert De Wilde remained at his post, observing these developments from behind a stack of schedules and requisition forms. He had not acted with any formal directive from the resistance, nor had he confided in any colleagues. His actions remained solitary and careful, but the signs of disruption were no longer isolated. A pattern was emerging, even if only visible to those with enough oversight to observe multiple regions. In August, a transport carrying spare brake assemblies intended for use in panzer divisions stalled outside Verviers. According to its manifest, it had been routed through secondary lines to avoid congestion in the main corridor, a decision inexplicably made at Liège-Guillemins. The routing slip, when reviewed by a German inspector, bore the correct stamp and appeared in order. Yet a discrepancy in the departure time raised questions. The convoy had departed 6 hours later than scheduled, and no record of the delay had been filed. Clerical oversight was blamed. A reprimand was issued to the shift dispatcher, and the matter was closed without further inquiry. Around this time, German supervisors introduced a new control measure: sealed routing orders, to be opened only at designated intervals by verified personnel. This was intended to prevent unauthorized alterations and ensure that sensitive shipments reached their destinations unimpeded. The process added another layer of security but also slowed the flow of information and introduced additional complications for clerks tasked with rapid data entry. For De Wilde, this marked a turning point. His prior methods, quietly adjusting train numbers, swapping car sequence codes, or modifying routing logic, were now more difficult to apply. He adapted by exploiting the gaps between procedures. The sealing process created its own blind spots. Once a document was sealed and dispatched, it was rarely checked again unless an incident occurred, and in many cases, especially with low-priority trains, German staff were lax about enforcing the sealing procedure. More significantly, De Wilde began to notice that he was not alone in his efforts. Small inconsistencies began to appear in reports filed from other stations. One day, a signal officer at a rural siding near Vizay logged a freight train's arrival an hour earlier than its recorded departure time from Liège, an impossibility unless the record had been altered. Another week, a locomotive bearing Wehrmacht medical markings arrived at the wrong yard in Charleroi, and remained there overnight before the mistake was discovered. The train's original routing orders, upon review, were mysteriously missing from the station's files. De Wilde never reached out to verify these actions or confirm a network of saboteurs, but he began to suspect that others within the railway system were acting independently, just as he was, testing the limits of German oversight and probing the vulnerabilities of an otherwise rigid bureaucracy. Meanwhile, pressure on the rail system intensified. Following setbacks on the Eastern Front, most notably the grinding halt outside Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht demanded faster, more reliable resupply chains from Western Europe. The German Transport Directorate issued circulars emphasizing discipline and efficiency. Belgian staff were warned that any sign of resistance, even passive, would be met with arrest and prosecution. A list of counterproductive behaviours was posted in every station: lateness, incomplete logs, unauthorized use of railway telephones. At Liège-Guillemins, a uniformed Gestapo liaison began appearing weekly, his presence a quiet but potent warning. He seldom spoke to the clerks but observed carefully. On one occasion, De Wilde watched as the man silently followed a young switchboard operator out of the building. The operator never returned. Tension grew within the workforce. Some Belgian employees resigned quietly, citing health reasons or transferring to less exposed rural lines. Others began arriving earlier, working longer shifts, and adopting an air of nervous precision. But for De Wilde, this atmosphere of fear confirmed the effectiveness of his actions. The occupiers were unsure of the source of their logistical headaches. Their broad measures and heightened scrutiny were the responses of a system unable to pinpoint the problem. Despite the risk, he continued, in September 1942, a particularly disruptive event occurred. A convoy of flatbed cars loaded with dismantled radar equipment destined for a Luftwaffe installation near Lille failed to arrive. The convoy had departed Liège on time, but somewhere along its route, it had been diverted onto a defunct branch line used during peacetime for livestock transport. When the train was discovered nearly 2 days later, the equipment had been looted, whether by civilians or resistance partisans was unclear. An internal investigation was launched. This time, inspectors scrutinized the scheduling records at Liège-Guillemins more thoroughly. De Wilde, whose signature appeared on a document authorizing one of the intermediate stops, was questioned briefly. He responded with plausible explanations and provided alternative paperwork to support his claim that the error had likely occurred after the train had left his station. His calm demeanour, familiarity with procedures, and lack of any prior disciplinary record worked in his favour. Still, the net was tightening. The Germans began implementing a new rotation system. Clerks were reassigned every 6 weeks to different stations to prevent them from developing localized influence. This policy, while logical on paper, caused operational confusion and led to new bottlenecks, as clerks unfamiliar with their new stations made errors under pressure. De Wilde, due for reassignment by late October, requested a deferral on the grounds of ill health. A sympathetic Belgian supervisor approved the request. He remained at Liège, at least temporarily. But the episode reminded him that his position, his ability to act, was now more precarious than ever. Even as he worked to remain unnoticed, the broader situation worsened. German officers issued daily warnings about sabotage, and several clerks from nearby depots were arrested and sent to internment centres for questioning. In Brussels, the SNCB headquarters had begun compiling lists of suspicious incidents, categorising them under human error, material fault or unknown cause. Many of the entries De Wilde realised involved trains that had passed through Liège-Guillemins, yet no definitive link had been drawn. The disruptions, however consistent, remained subtle enough to pass as random inefficiencies in a complex system. The Germans continued to issue new policies, rotate personnel, and enforce stricter controls, and the trains continued to falter. By November 1942, winter had returned to Belgium. The nights grew longer, and coal shortages began to affect even the German garrisoned installations. Railway clerks wore heavier coats indoors as heating was rationed. The chill in the air was mirrored by a growing sense of isolation among Belgian workers like Albert De Wilde, who had managed to avoid detection for nearly a year while continuing his quiet acts of interference. Outside the walls of the Liège-Guillemins station, the war was intensifying. The German defeat at El Alamein, the Allied landings in North Africa, and Soviet pressure at Stalingrad all signalled to the wider world that the German tide might be turning. But inside the railway system, none of this was yet visible. The trains still ran. Orders still flowed from Berlin. Demands on Belgian infrastructure were heavier than ever. The Reich Transport Directorate issued new quotas. Additional train convoys would now pass through Belgium, bound for the Eastern Front with winter clothing, anti-tank supplies, and railway repair units. Each train was to be accounted for, inspected, and verified at each node. Liège, with its central position, remained a key transfer point. Albert De Wilde, still in his clerical post thanks to a delayed rotation order, understood the implications. More convoys meant more oversight, but also more opportunities, more paperwork, more points of failure, and more chance for subtle disruption. Yet the risks had changed. He was no longer one of many invisible clerks in a wide system. Now, under new German protocols, the pool of trusted Belgian employees had shrunk. Paper trails were being reviewed more frequently, and any inconsistencies were being cross-referenced with previous reports. On 12th of November, De Wilde was quietly summoned to the office of the new station commander, Oberinspector Hermann Kruger, a man recently transferred from Düsseldorf. Kruger, meticulous and formal, had been tasked with improving logistical throughput across all Belgian routes. He questioned De Wilde in a calm but probing manner, focusing on discrepancies in two separate routing sheets from September. De Wilde answered factually and presented handwritten amendments authorised by a prior shift supervisor, now transferred to Namur. Kruger appeared unsatisfied, but said nothing further. For De Wilde, this moment marked a subtle but irreversible shift. He could no longer assume anonymity within the system. His knowledge of procedures now made him both valuable and vulnerable. The quiet space in which he had operated for months was narrowing. And so, in the days following the interrogation, he made a choice. He began to document everything, not in the official ledgers which could be seized, but in a small personal ledger, hidden beneath the bottom drawer of his desk. There he recorded dates, train numbers, routing orders he had altered, and the specific discrepancies introduced. He knew such a record could condemn him, but also understood its potential value. If the occupation were to end, if Allied forces did one day reach Belgium, this ledger might serve to explain what could not otherwise be seen in the mountains of official documentation. More than that, De Wilde began to act with deliberate purpose. Until now, his alterations had been driven by observation, routine, and opportunity. Now they were intentional. He identified patterns in supply that recurred weekly: medical convoys on Mondays, armoured repair shipments on Thursdays, refrigerated food stores each Saturday. He no longer simply delayed trains. He began to redirect them. In one instance, a convoy of radio components was misrouted onto a line normally used for livestock freight and left idle for nearly 36 hours. In another, a German train transporting replacement axles for the Eastern Front was redirected through a rural siding where partisans had been reported. By the time it reached its destination, 2 of its flat cars were missing. Still, these actions were framed as clerical error. German investigators, overstretched and unfamiliar with the nuances of Belgian geography, chalked it up to the complexity of managing so many shipments across occupied territories. De Wilde continued to play the role of loyal employee, logging each transaction with clean, practiced handwriting, but the risk was no longer abstract. On 25 November, the Gestapo arrested a station worker in Namur who had been caught smuggling handwritten notes about German train movements to a resistance cell. The arrest sent ripples through the railway community. That worker, it turned out, had once trained under the same supervisor as De Wilde. Rumours spread quickly. Some believed the Germans had begun compiling lists of suspected sympathisers within the SNCB. 3 days later, an internal audit team arrived unannounced at Liège-Guillemins. Files were pulled, desks searched. De Wilde watched as a uniformed officer rifled through his schedule drawer, pausing to examine a set of routing stamps. But the drawer beneath, which concealed his personal ledger, was never opened. The team left after several hours, confiscating 2 boxes of documents but making no arrests. Still, the message was clear. De Wilde began arriving earlier and leaving later, ensuring that he had time to monitor train activity during quieter hours. He developed subtle methods of covering his tracks. When modifying a routing slip, he would replicate the handwriting of another clerk. When delays occurred, he would preemptively file a report citing a faulty signal or miscommunication with the Charleroi dispatch office. These small acts required constant vigilance. One misstep, one unmatched record, and the illusion would collapse. Yet in this growing tension, De Wilde found clarity. He no longer operated in cautious improvisation. He had made his decision to hinder the machinery of occupation as much as one man, alone in a clerical position, possibly could. The weeks passed in quiet strain. Snow began to fall in December, dusting the marshalling yards outside the station in white. The trains came and went, metal wheels screeching over frozen rails. German officers stamped their boots and barked orders, and behind the frost-rimmed windows of his station desk, De Wilde worked in silence, his pen the only instrument of resistance he would ever wield. Each stroke of ink, each misplaced digit, each forged initial, these were no longer just acts of quiet protest. They were deliberate engagements in a war he would never physically see, but one that, in his own way, he had chosen to fight. January 1943 arrived with sleet and biting winds. Belgian workers at Liège-Guillemins railway station huddled around coal stoves where permitted, but fuel shortages meant long hours in the cold. The pace of train movements had only increased. With the German Sixth Army now encircled at Stalingrad and Axis supply chains in Eastern Europe under strain, the importance of Western rail logistics rose again. Every junction, every signal post, every clerk now came under sharper watch. For Albert De Wilde, the new year brought neither relief nor reprieve. The momentum of his work, the quiet diversions, the errors engineered into seemingly flawless paperwork, had become routine. Yet, it was no longer enough to go unnoticed. The atmosphere had shifted. The Reich Transport Directorate issued a memorandum, circulated through all stations under occupation, declaring that sabotage in rail operations was now to be treated as treason. Unexplained deviations or missing cargo, the document stated, will be presumed hostile unless conclusively proven otherwise. Gestapo and SD units were formally authorized to investigate personnel without prior approval from local Wehrmacht officers. These orders were not idle threats. On the 14th of January, a station master at the Leuven depot was arrested for inattention resulting in strategic disruption. A delayed arms shipment to Metz. Eyewitnesses claimed he was taken without resistance. He had worked for the railways for 22 years. No public charges were announced. A week later, a junior signal officer at Namur disappeared following an audit of communication logs. At Liège-Guillemins, De Wilde observed all of this in silence. He still recorded his alterations in the small hidden ledger. He still adjusted routing slips when opportunity permitted. But the pressure was mounting. German staff, once indifferent, now hovered during routine clerical tasks. Checklists were verified twice. Stamp logs were recorded in duplicate. The margin for error had shrunk to a sliver, yet De Wilde did not stop. On 21st January, a critical shipment of aviation fuel scheduled to transit Liège en route to Ghent never arrived. Its paperwork traced back to De Wilde's shift. When summoned, he calmly presented an alternate routing slip, one bearing the signature of a deceased supervisor. He explained that the slip had been issued weeks earlier and reused in error. The officer who reviewed the case, unfamiliar with the deceased clerk, accepted the explanation and filed it as clerical misassignment. But De Wilde knew such protection was unlikely to hold again. 3 days later, he was confronted again, this time by the Gestapo liaison. The questioning was sharper. Why was Train 6142 carrying steel casings sent to Marlouis instead of Bastogne? De Wilde adjusted his glasses, examined the printed manifest and replied, "I believe there was a miscommunication with the dispatcher in Signy. I was told to forward it to the secondary line. The rerouting note should be in the telegraph log." They did not find the note. He was allowed to return to work, but only under observation. From that day forward, De Wilde was shadowed during each shift by a younger clerk named Louis Hollart, who had recently joined the station under German recommendation. Hollart was polite, attentive, and said little. But De Wilde recognised him for what he was, an informant. The Germans had placed him there not for supervision, but for exposure. The system was closing in. The resistance network in Liège, which had once been loosely connected to sympathetic workers across the transportation sector, had suffered a series of blows. Raids in the Outremeuse district had led to the arrest of 2 postal officials and a tram conductor. Individuals rumoured to have passed messages or facilitated covert transit. Their connection to De Wilde was tangential at best, but fear now hung over every quiet corner of the station. And yet, amid all this, a strange thing happened. One evening in early February, De Wilde returned to his desk after a break to find a routing slip placed neatly on top of his manifest book. It bore the correct stamp, but the station code on the second leg of the journey was subtly incorrect, 1 number transposed. To the untrained eye, it looked like a mistake. To De Wilde, it was unmistakable. Someone else was still operating. He looked around the office. Hollart was seated nearby, absorbed in copying delivery receipts. Another clerk, Marie van Broek, was logging rolling stock requisitions. No one looked up. No one spoke. But the message had been left clearly for him to find. It was a signal, a quiet acknowledgement that the resistance, in some form, still lived within the bureaucracy of occupation. With new confidence, De Wilde resolved to continue, but even more cautiously. He no longer acted alone, yet he understood that recognition would mean nothing if caught. The question was no longer just about how to disrupt the German war machine, but how to survive while doing so. Later that same month, an official from the Reichsbahn arrived unannounced and demanded a full inventory of rerouting incidents over the past 3 months. De Wilde spent hours compiling data, carefully excluding the most sensitive discrepancies. But when the official departed, he left behind a single instruction. Beginning March 1st, all Belgian clerks will be subject to weekly performance reviews under German supervision. The message was clear, their time was running out, yet even as this new scrutiny loomed, De Wilde performed one final alteration before February's end. A troop transport scheduled to move through Liège at 22 Ulm was delayed by 2 hours through a falsified maintenance report. During the delay, resistance agents sabotaged a nearby track segment under cover of night. The train was rerouted the next morning. No one ever linked the reroute to De Wilde, but for the first time he felt the weight of his actions, not as a matter of clerical subtlety, but as a matter of life and death. His role had shifted from passive interference to active enabler. The system knew he existed, even if it didn't know his name, and now, with each passing day, he risked not just dismissal or imprisonment, but something final. By early March, a formal review of Liège-Guillemins was underway. De Wilde knew it would be his last. On the morning of March 7, 1943, Albert De Wilde arrived at Liège-Guillemins station, as he had done for nearly 2 decades. The sky was grey and low with mist, and a light freezing drizzle coated the iron tracks outside. Inside the office, the atmosphere was tense but subdued. The German-appointed station chief had not arrived. A new set of bulletins hung on the wall, including one written in red ink. Enhanced screening for personnel with irregular clerical histories is now in effect. De Wilde, coat buttoned, gloves in hand, made his way past the dispatcher's table and settled at his desk. He noticed right away that his ledger drawer had been opened slightly, not in a way that was obvious, but enough that his careful alignment of folders had been disrupted. He said nothing. The small personal record book he had kept, his quiet accounting of every deviation he had orchestrated, was gone. He had known the risk. From the moment he began recording his actions, he had accepted the possibility of discovery. Still, the confirmation of it, someone had found and taken it, settled over him like the cold. That day, no officer came for him. There was no confrontation, no arrest. He remained at his post, signed departure logs, adjusted one final telegraph form, but he knew that his time at the station had reached its end. The following morning, his name was missing from the new shift rotation chart. He was not dismissed. Instead, he was reassigned, on paper, to a minor supply depot outside the city, a junction rarely used since pre-war days. No transportation was arranged for him. No specific duties were listed. It was a non-assignment, a method of quiet removal that required no formal accusation. By eliminating his access, the Germans severed the risk. De Wilde understood. He packed his few personal belongings, an ink blotter, 2 pens, and a worn railway timetable, and left without ceremony. No farewell was given. The other clerks, many of whom suspected more than they ever admitted, watched in silence. He never returned to railway work. In the months that followed, Liège-Guillemins continued to experience unexplained routing errors. Trains arrived late or not at all. The disruptions were smaller, less frequent, but they did not vanish. De Wilde's methods had shown others what was possible. Several clerks, working independently or in pairs, adopted his techniques, altering routing slips, mislabeling manifests, and inserting delays under the cover of mechanical fault or human oversight. In July 1943, a coordinated resistance action struck a munitions train outside Hergenrath, enabled by a falsified schedule that originated from Liège. Though no individual was named, internal investigations confirmed the station's continued unreliability. In response, the German command transferred several Belgian staff, and for a period placed Liège under direct German operational control. Albert De Wilde never sought to return. He lived out the remainder of the occupation quietly in a modest apartment near Rue de Campine. He took work as a bookkeeper for a small textile firm and avoided any political activity. His former colleagues rarely saw him. He spoke of the war only once in a letter written to a cousin after the liberation of Liège in September 1944, in which he mentioned only this: "I did not raise a weapon, nor did I ever leave my post, but I made their trains late." After the war, the Belgian National Railway reviewed personnel files from the occupation period. Most wartime actions were difficult to verify. Resistance work done without documentation or recognition was often left unrecorded. De Wilde's name appeared only briefly, in a reassignment note dated March 1943, marked "Clerical Suitability Reviewed." No accusations, no commendations. It was not until 1951, during a departmental review of wartime transport anomalies, that a former SNCB administrator rediscovered a partial copy of De Wilde's hidden ledger, preserved in a separate folder misfiled under abandoned freight claims. The document, though incomplete, revealed entries that corresponded with several unexplained disruptions during the war. Handwriting analysis later confirmed the author. There was no formal ceremony, no medal. But in 1954, a small note was appended to De Wilde's employment record under the Wartime Activities section. Conducted independent resistance through clerical interference. No detection during occupation. Actions contributed to operational delay of enemy transport. Albert De Wilde died in 1960 at the age of 71. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. No street bears his name. No statue was ever raised. But within the railways of Belgium, his story passed quietly between clerks and dispatchers for years afterward. A reminder that resistance was not always loud, not always recognised, and not always visible. Sometimes it sat at a desk, rearranging paperwork, redirecting trains, and waiting for the machinery of war to falter.